Imagine holding a document in your hands, a piece of paper that is so inherently dangerous, so volatile, that simply reading its terms out loud, like just doing the math in public, could literally cost you your life.
Right. I mean, it sounds like the inciting incident of some geopolitical thriller,
Exactly.
like you'd think it was a list of undercover intelligence assets or maybe launch codes, something designed to be a weapon.
Yeah, but the document we are looking at today for this deep dive, it wasn't a dossier of state secrets at all. It was just a contract.
A commercial lease.
Right, a commercial lease for a mining concession. So today, we're diving into a really extensive research dossier centered on the INCO, or EXMIBAL nickel concession, down at Lake Izabal in Guatemala.
Yeah, and the scope of this is just massive.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to trace how a single 40-year lease, which was signed way back in the 1960s, basically became the catalyst for a decades-long cycle of violence.
Violence, forced displacement, and these landmark international legal battles.
Battles that are literally still playing out today, right now, as you're listening to this.
Yeah, the timeline goes right up to the present.
We are going to look at the indigenous Quechua Maya communities who were forced off their land at gunpoint, and the brilliant academics who were assassinated simply for auditing this mining contract.
Which is just a chilling detail.
It's unbelievable. And we'll get into how the mine's incredibly long shadow has stretched into the modern era, as the property was kind of endlessly shuffled across American, Canadian, and eventually Russian corporate owners.
And look, just right up front, looking at the historical record here, impartially, we're dealing with some deeply heavy material today.
Yeah, definitely a sober topic.
Very sober. The sources provided to us, they cover political assassinations, forced evictions, and sexual violence. So we're going to walk through this with a very documentary-style exactness.
Just sticking to the facts.
Exactly. We're looking at competing claims, U.S.-backed military actions, massive corporate legal battles. And I want to make it super clear to you listening, our role here isn't to endorse any specific political viewpoint or, take a side.
Right. We're not doing that.
No. We're simply reporting the facts, the timelines, and the legal arguments exactly as they exist in the historical dossier and the actual court records.
So with that established, let's look at the political soil where this contract was even planted. Because, you don't just walk into a sovereign country and walk out with a 40-year lease for hundreds of square kilometers of land without some serious geopolitical backing.
You absolutely do not.
So the timeline here starts to really matter right around 1954. What makes that specific year the pivot point?
Well, 1954 completely rewrote the DNA of modern Guatemalan history. I mean, that was the year of a massive political coup.
Right.
A coup that was heavily backed and orchestrated by the United States, specifically the CIA. They ran it under the codename Operation PB Success.
Operation PB Success. And this intervention overthrew the democratically elected government, right? Jacobo Arbenz.
Exactly, Jacobo Arbenz.
And Arbenz was the one who was really pushing agrarian reform, right? Like trying to redistribute uncultivated land to landless peasant farmers.
Yes, which obviously terrified the massive foreign agricultural companies operating down there at the time.
Because they held basically all the unused land.
Right. Historically, when we hear about the 1954 coup, the narrative is almost entirely dominated by agriculture. Like you hear about the United Fruit Company and bananas.
Oh, yeah, the classic Banana Republic history.
Exactly. The Arbenz government's land reforms directly threatened United Fruit's massive land holdings.
Right.
So the U.S. intervenes, citing Cold War fears of communism, and they install a military regime.
A regime that was very friendly to those foreign companies?
Very friendly. By design, this post-coup military order was incredibly favorable to foreign corporate interests. But the detail that, often gets lost in the history books is that this new military government didn't just reverse the agricultural reforms.
What else did they do?
They started looking down. They began looking at the subsoil.
They realized the wealth wasn't just in what you could grow on the dirt, but what you could dig up from under it.
Exactly. The military government essentially opened the country's mineral wealth to foreign extraction. And they did it under terms that were incredibly favorable to outside capital.
Okay, so who shows up to take advantage of that?
Well, just 2 years after the coup, in 1956, we see the first major player enter the region we're talking about today, the Hanna Mining Company.
Hanna Mining, where are they from?
They're an American firm based out of Cleveland, Ohio, and they obtained the original exploration licenses in the Izabal region.
Okay, so the very first flag planted on this specific mining project is American.
Mhm.
But looking at the dossier, that corporate landscape doesn't stay static for very long at all. By 1960, there's a massive shift in ownership.
Yeah, a huge shift. In 1960, a Canadian mining giant steps into the picture, right? INCO, which stands for the International Nickel Company of Canada. They swoop in and buy a massive stake, roughly 80% in the project from Hanna Mining.
80%, wow.
Yeah. And to actually operate on the ground in Guatemala, they form a local subsidiary called EXMIBAL.
Okay, I want to pause on that for a second because the dossier highlights this as a really crucial distinction.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about Latin American history in the mid-20th century, I feel like the default assumption is just American corporate hegemony, right?
Absolutely.
Like American companies guarded by American-backed dictators, that's the trope. But here, the flow of capital is totally different. The military state that ultimately protected this concession was absolutely U.S.-backed, U.S.-funded, and trained by the U.S.
Yes, that part is true.
But the actual mining capital, like the millions of dollars, the corporate board making the extraction decisions, that was primarily Canadian, not American.
Right, it is a fascinating structural inversion. You essentially have Canadian capital functioning under the security umbrella of a U.S.-backed military regime.
It's kind of wild to think about.
It is. It really highlights how international resource extraction worked in practice. The U.S. provided the geopolitical stability or, instability, depending on your perspective, that made the region safe for foreign investment generally.
And the Canadian mining interests were just perfectly positioned to walk right through that open door.
Exactly. So this Canadian-controlled entity, EXMIBAL, they begin deep negotiations with Guatemala's military government in 1960 to really formalize their long-term mining rights.
Which is a genuinely chilling piece of timing, because 1960 is the exact same year that the Guatemalan Civil War officially begins.
Yeah.
A civil war that would end up lasting for 36 years.
Right, and those negotiations, they're playing out against this backdrop of an escalating, brutal civil war.
Yeah.
And they finally culminate in 1965.
What do they get in 65?
The military government grants EXMIBAL a massive 40-year lease. This lease covers roughly 385 square kilometers of land near Lake Izabal.
Okay, let's try to visualize 385 square kilometers for a second, because just seeing that number on a page is kind of an abstraction.
It's huge.
It's an enormous physical footprint. We're not talking about like a single mine shaft and a gravel parking lot. That is the size of a major metropolitan city, or like an entire county in some places.
Oh yeah, it's a vast territory.
And they secure the legal right from the military to just dig it up, build processing plants, pave roads, build infrastructure, all of it for 40 years.
And a 40-year lease is essentially generational.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. The men who signed that contract in 1965, they knew they would likely be retired or dead before it even expired.
That's a crazy way to look at it.
It means that children born on that land in 1966 would grow into adulthood, have children of their own, reach middle age, all while living entirely under the legal shadow of a foreign corporation's claim to their home.
It literally freezes the development of an entire region for half a century and just hands the keys over to an overseas boardroom.
Exactly.
Which honestly brings up a glaring logistical problem. You have this massive tract of land, 385 square kilometers, but it's not a barren desert. It's not an empty void.
No, not at all.
The indigenous Quechua communities have lived there, farmed there, and built their societies there for generations upon generations. So if I am an executive sitting in a boardroom in Toronto, and I just acquired a piece of paper saying I have the rights to 385 square kilometers of inhabited land in Central America, how do I actually secure that physical footprint?
Right.
Because I can't exactly just send a polite letter asking thousands of people to pack up their farms and leave.
No, you definitely cannot. And the answer to that question is where the sterile administrative reality of a corporate contract collides violently with the physical reality of state power.
The military comes in.
Yes. To secure the ground for an industrial mining operation of that massive scale, the ground had to be cleared. And this clearing process happens during the late 1960s, right as the Guatemalan Civil War is severely escalating.
The dossier points us to a specific, highly controversial figure who enters the narrative here. Colonel Carlos Arana Osorio. Who was he, and what was his mandate?
Colonel Arana Osorio was a high-ranking military officer, and he's a guy who would actually leverage his brutal success in this era to eventually become the president of Guatemala in 1970.
Oh, wow. Upward mobility through brutality.
Exactly. In the late 1960s, he was tasked with running a U.S.-supported counterinsurgency campaign across the eastern regions of the country, specifically Izabal and Zacapa.
And what was the official reason for the campaign?
The official state mandate was to root out leftist guerrilla insurgencies that had supposedly taken hold in the rural areas.
So, relying on the Cold War framing again, we're fighting communists, so we need to sweep the region.
Right. But the campaign he executed between 1966 and 1968, it was not a surgical military operation against armed combatants in the jungle.
What was it?
It was a campaign of extreme, indiscriminate brutality against the civilian population. It was so bloody, so defined by massacres and terror, that Arana Osorio earned a terrifying moniker, the Butcher of Zacapa.
The Butcher of Zacapa. And I am looking at the maps provided in our dossier, and this is where the history becomes just incredibly grim. Because if you overlay the map of the military's counterinsurgency campaign with the map of the EXMIBAL mining concession, they are essentially the exact same map.
The overlap is impossible to ignore. As the counterinsurgency sweeps through these specific regions, the indigenous Quechua Maya communities are violently and forcibly displaced from their ancestral lands.
So the military is clearing out the civilians.
Yes. The very land that was cleared of its inhabitants by the military's scorched earth tactics was the exact land required by the foreign corporation to build and operate their mine.
Wait, I need to understand the mechanics of this accusation. Are you saying the military actively used the cover of a Civil War counterinsurgency claiming they were hunting armed communist guerrillas as a pretext to essentially do the violent eviction work for a massive industrial mining project?
That is exactly the core accusation made by critics, community defenders, and human rights historians. They argue it was a symbiotic clearing of the ground. The state wanted to eliminate any potential rural support for the insurgency, right? But the state also desperately wanted the foreign investment from the nickel mine to succeed.
Because it brings in money.
Exactly. So displacing the Quechua Maya achieved both goals simultaneously.
Now, navigating this neutrally, as we promised, the dossier is very careful to flag a few heavily contested historical points here regarding this specific 1960s period. First, the human cost. What are the actual numbers?
Right, so the death tolls from Colonel Arana Osorio's campaign in Izabal and Zacapa are frequently cited by human rights organizations and historical commissions to be in the thousands. I mean, entire communities were decimated.
Thousands of people.
Yes. However, it is absolutely vital to state that these figures are derived from after-the-fact human rights estimates, survivor testimonies, and historical reconstructions.
Right, because the perpetrators aren't keeping receipts.
Exactly. Because we are talking about a state-sponsored campaign of terror, there is no precise official state registry of the dead from these specific sweeps. We are dealing with the historical archaeology of a massacre, which makes verifying exact individual casualty numbers incredibly difficult.
That makes sense. And the second contested point, which seems to be the most fiercely debated aspect of this entire foundational era, is what was the actual role of the mining company? Did EXMIBAL and its parent company, INCO, directly participate in this violence?
This is a critical, legal, and historical distinction, and the narratives split very sharply here. On one side, some accounts and critics argue that the company was deeply complicit.
What do they point to?
They suggest that the company had to have coordinated with the military sharing maps, identifying logistical goals, essentially pointing out which lands needed to be pacified before their mining operations could begin.
Basically saying, we need to build a smelter right here. Can you clear this valley out for us?
Right, exactly. And then on the other side of the argument.
Yeah, what's the corporate defense?
The opposing argument frames the company merely as the passive beneficiary of state violence.
Passive beneficiary.
Yeah. In this view, the Guatemalan military was conducting a brutal counterinsurgency for its own ideological and political reasons. The military cleared the land to fight a war, and the mining company simply moved their equipment into the vacuum that the state created.
So they're saying it was just a dark coincidence?
Pretty much. They argue they didn't order the violence, they didn't fund the death squads, and they didn't direct the military commanders. They just legally occupied the land after the fact, operating under the terms of their valid lease.
So it's kind of like the difference between hiring a demolition crew to illegally bulldoze an apartment building so you can build a parking lot versus just happening to buy an empty lot at a massive discount after someone else already burned the building down.
That is exactly the debate. The distinction between active complicity, passive benefit, and direct authorship of violence is heavily argued in the historical literature.
But the outcome is the same for the people who live there.
Yes. The undeniable record shows that the company operated on land cleared by state terror. But definitive, documentary proof of the company issuing commands to the military during this specific 1960s phase, that remains a fiercely contested narrative.
Okay, so by the late 1960s, the physical ground is secured. The 40-year lease is signed and active. The physical opposition on the ground, the communities living there, has been devastated and scattered by the military's counterinsurgency.
Right.
You would think the path is totally clear for the company at this point. But this is where the conflict shifts domains in a really unexpected way. It moves from the rural lowlands of Lake Izabal to the capital city. It moves from physical opposition to intellectual opposition.
Yes.
Because in 1969, a group of academics decides to do something incredibly dangerous.
We see the formation of what becomes known as the USAC Commission.
The USAC Commission.
Yes, a specialized group formed at the University of San Carlos, USCC, which is Guatemala's premier national university. This was a panel of prominent professors, economists, and lawyers who decided to formally, rigorously, and publicly read and analyze the EXMIBAL contract.
I really want to spend significant time on this group because, honestly, this is the core of our deep dive today. The men on this commission literally died for reading a contract.
They did.
Who were these people? They weren't armed insurgents hiding in the mountains.
Far from it. These were some of the brightest, most respected academic and legal minds in the entire country. They really represented the intellectual elite of Guatemala's progressive movement.
Who specifically are we talking about?
The dossier highlights several key figures. There was Alfonso Bauer Paiz, a highly prominent professor and lawyer with a long history of public service. There was Julio Camey Herrera, another very distinguished legal scholar.
Okay.
There was Rafael Piedrasanta Arandi, an expert in economics. And perhaps most notably, there was Adolfo Mijangos López.
Adolfo Mijangos López. He was a sitting congressman, right?
Yes. He was a lawyer, a university professor, and a sitting elected member of the National Congress. He was a brilliant legal mind who also happened to be a polio survivor, meaning he relied on a wheelchair for mobility.
And these four men were leading this charge.
Right. These four men, along with others at the university, formed this commission with a very specific, almost forensic goal. They wanted to conduct a line-by-line financial and legal audit of the mining concession and present their findings to the public.
So they're looking at the math. They're looking at the legal structure of the lease itself. They aren't arguing about, like, communism or capitalism in the abstract. They're literally looking at spreadsheets.
Exactly.
And what do they find when they actually run the numbers?
They conclude, and they state this very publicly and vocally, that the EXMIBAL contract is an absolute giveaway of national sovereignty and natural resources.
Let's break down what the word giveaway means in this context, because they weren't just throwing that word around as a catchy political slogan for a rally. They were pointing to specific, highly technical terms in the lease itself.
Yes, their critique was grounded deeply in the fundamentals of national wealth and international corporate law. Let's look at the specific mechanisms they audited.
Okay.
First, they look at the royalty rates. A royalty is basically the fee a company pays to the state for the physical right to take a non-renewable resource like nickel out of the earth.
Okay, so percentage of what they take.
Exactly. And in many of these mid-century post-coup concessions across Latin America, the royalty rates were shockingly low. We're talking about rates that were sometimes barely 1%, 2%, or 3% of the market value of the extracted mineral.
Hold on, I'm struggling with the math there. 1 to 3%. For a non-renewable resource.
Yes.
Once you dig up a ton of nickel and ship it out of the country, it's gone forever. The country can never sell that specific ton of nickel again, and the state is only asking for pennies on the dollar.
That was the Commission's exact point. It wasn't an equitable partnership in any sense. It was an extraction of wealth that left the host nation virtually empty-handed. But it gets worse when you look at the second mechanism they studied, the tax terms. The USAC Commission found that the contract included massive, long-term tax holidays.
Can you explain what a tax holiday is in this context?
Sure. A tax holiday is a legal provision where the government agrees that the corporation will not have to pay corporate income tax or export taxes for a set period of time.
How long of a period?
Often these contracts granted tax exemptions for the first 5, 10, or even 20 years of the mine's operation.
Wait, up to 20 years of zero corporate taxes?
Yes.
Is that standard practice in the mining industry, or was that uniquely egregious for this specific military regime in Guatemala?
Well, it was a highly aggressive form of incentivization that was heavily favored by foreign capital at the time. The corporate justification is always that mining requires massive upfront capital investment.
Right, building the infrastructure.
Exactly. Building the smelters, laying the roads, constructing the power plants. They argue they need a decade of tax-free operation just to recoup their initial billion-dollar investment before they can even afford to pay taxes.
But the commission didn't buy that.
No. The USAC Commission argued that a tax holiday of that length, combined with mathematically negligible royalty rates, meant that the company could come in, dig up the nickel, process it, sell it on the booming global market, and the host country, the actual people of Guatemala, would see almost absolutely none of the profit for a generation.
They are essentially proving, mathematically, that the military government signed a terrible business deal for the country.
Yes. And the commission went even deeper than just the spreadsheets. They attacked the legal philosophy of the contract regarding subsoil rights.
Subsoil rights, what does that entail?
In many legal traditions, especially in Latin America, and this actually dates back to colonial Spanish law, the state, which represents the public, owns everything beneath the surface of the earth. You, as an individual citizen, might own the farm on top of the ground, but the nation collectively owns the minerals below.
So the mineral wealth is considered a national inheritance.
Precisely. It belongs to everyone. And the USAC Commission argued that handing over 385 square kilometers of that subsoil inheritance to a foreign entity for 40 years, on terms that legally allowed them to export the wealth without enriching the nation, was a fundamental violation of the public interest.
It's theft, basically.
It was a breach of the state's duty to its citizens.
This is where I find this entire story taking just a terrifying psychological turn. We just spent the first section talking about Colonel Arana Osorio fighting an actual shooting war.
Right.
A brutal, bloody counterinsurgency against armed guerrillas in the mountains. The state responding to physical military threats with extreme military force. But these men on the USAC Commission, they're academics in suits. They're sitting in university libraries with calculators. Adolfo Mijangos López is a sitting congressman doing a legal audit. They are talking about tax structures and royalty percentages. Why on earth was a tax audit treated as a mortal threat by a heavily armed military state?
Because a rigorous, publicly digestible legal critique threatens something far more vital than a military checkpoint. It threatens the perceived legitimacy of the entire economic model.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Think about it from the regime's perspective. If an armed guerrilla attacks a military convoy, the state knows exactly how to respond. They label them a communist terrorist, they deploy the army, and they use the attack to justify their own authoritarian existence.
Right, it reinforces their power.
That is a paradigm of power they understand and thrive in.
But a spreadsheet is different.
Entirely different. When a highly respected congressman and a panel of esteemed university professors release a meticulously researched, legally sound financial report proving that the government is essentially giving away the country's sovereign wealth to a foreign corporation, that destroys the state's credibility.
It pulls the curtain back.
It exposes the raw corruption at the heart of the military-corporate alliance.
It's kind of like the difference between attacking the walls of the castle, which just makes the king look strong when he defends it, versus pulling out a document in the town square proving that the king doesn't actually own the deed to the land and is secretly selling off the villagers' property for his own profit.
That is an excellent analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And this state realized that this intellectual opposition was gaining serious public traction. The USAC Commission wasn't just writing dense papers for obscure academic journals. They were making the Guatemalan public realize that their national inheritance was being sold out from under them for pennies.
And people were listening.
Yes. And that is a level of foundational dissent that a regime built purely on resource extraction and military force simply cannot tolerate. It struck at the very financial heart of why the 1954 coup happened in the first place.
Which leads us to the darkest chapter of this era, the price of that dissent. We are moving into the years 1970 and 1971 now, and the question of why a tax audit was treated as a mortal threat is answered in the most brutal, definitive way imaginable.
The sequence of violence against the commission members is chilling in its precision. This wasn't a mass arrest or a chaotic police crackdown.
No.
It was a targeted, systematic elimination of the specific individuals who understood the contract the best. In November of 1970, the violence begins. The prominent lawyer, Julio Camey Herrera, is assassinated in the capital.
Just like that. One of the leading voices of the commission, gone.
Yes. And during that exact same period, the Professor Alfonso Bauer Paiz is targeted. He is shot in an assassination attempt, though he miraculously survives the attack and is forced to flee into exile.
It's a completely unambiguous message to the university and the public. Stop looking at the contract. Stop talking about the royalties. Stop doing the math.
But the core members didn't stop. They continued to speak out. And then we reach January 13, 1971.
Walk us through what happened that day.
This is the assassination of Adolfo Mijangos López. It is an event that deeply, deeply scarred the national consciousness of Guatemala, largely because of the brazenness and the specific cruelty of the act.
Right.
As we mentioned, Mijangos López was a polio survivor who used a wheelchair. On that day, he was leaving his office in Guatemala City. He was in his wheelchair, navigating the street, and he was shot in the back and killed right there in public.
I mean, just pause and consider the visual of that reality. A brilliant legal mind, an elected member of the National Congress, a man physically confined to a wheelchair, shot in the back in the middle of the city.
It's horrific.
It is an act of such overwhelming cowardly violence. It strips away any possible pretense that the state was fighting a war against combatants. You don't shoot a man in a wheelchair in the back because he's a physical threat. You do it as a public execution.
Exactly. It was an execution designed to maximize psychological terror. It was meant to demonstrate absolute impunity. It showed that no one, not a congressman, not an academic, not a disabled man, was safe if they threatened the economic interests of the concession.
And it worked.
From a grim, tactical perspective, it achieved its goal. It permanently silenced the most prominent, legally authoritative critics of the EXMIBAL deal.
And if you want to understand the terrifying mechanics of how this power structure functioned, you only have to look at the timeline of the immediate aftermath. The timing here isn't just suspicious, it's honestly damning.
It truly is a stark sequence of events. Adolfo Mijangos López is murdered in the middle of January 1971. Within mere weeks of his assassination, by February of 1971, EXMIBAL and the military government formally reached an agreement on the final terms of the concession.
So the exact favorable terms, the low royalties, the huge tax holidays that the commission had so fiercely opposed and stalled, are suddenly locked in.
Yes. The intellectual roadblock is removed via assassination, and the contract is smoothly signed immediately afterward.
Now, again, adhering strictly to our commitment to neutrality and presenting the historical record exactly as it stands legally, we must address another heavily contested point here. We have the bodies. We have the timeline. But who actually ordered the hit? Who pulled the trigger? And whose desk did the order come from?
This is a crucial point of historical and legal exactness. The killings of the USAC Commission members, the murder of Camey Herrera, the attempted murder of Bauer Paiz, and the assassination of Mijangos López are widely and uniformly attributed by historians, truth commissions, and international human rights organizations to state or state-linked death squads.
Okay, so paramilitary.
Yes. These paramilitary squads were acting, ostensibly, to protect the EXMIBAL concession and the military government's broader economic agenda.
Right, but what about the company? What about INCO or EXMIBAL executives? Are they implicated legally?
This is where the legal record halts. Direct command responsibility, meaning a provable paper trail order or a recorded directive from a specific military commander, let alone a corporate executive in Canada or Guatemala, saying, assassinate Adolfo Mijangos López, was never established in a court of law.
So it is a highly circumstantial, though incredibly loud, historical record.
Very loud, yes.
The motive for the murders is glaringly clear. The timing of the contract signing immediately after the murders is undeniable. The entities who wanted the critics gone got exactly what they wanted the very moment the critics were killed. But in terms of a judicial conviction linking the triggerman on the street to the corporate boardroom or the presidential palace, that definitive proof doesn't exist.
Correct.
Yeah.
As analysts of this dossier, we maintain neutrality by stating this as a historically open question regarding legal liability. We can lay out the factual sequence of events, the meticulous legal criticism, the targeted assassinations of those specific critics, and the immediate signing of the contract.
The listener can look at that sequence and draw their own conclusions about cause and effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we must be precise that formal, final legal liability for these specific 1970s assassinations was never successfully adjudicated. The perpetrators operated with total impunity.
Okay, let's take a breath and survey where we are in the narrative. We have a massive 385 square kilometer tract of land violently cleared by a military counterinsurgency that displaced thousands.
Yeah.
We have the intellectual opposition wiped out by targeted public assassinations.
Check.
The 40-year lease is signed, sealed, and active. The path is completely, ruthlessly clear. From a purely cynical business perspective, you would expect that after paying such an unimaginably high human price, after all that bloodshed and political capital spent, this mine is going to become the biggest, most aggressively lucrative operation on the planet.
You'd think so.
You'd expect it to run nonstop, churning out nickel 24/7 for the next 40 years.
And this is where the history of this concession takes a turn into deep, almost absurd irony. After all that preparation, all that violence, and all that political maneuvering, the Phoenix Mine, which is the specific name of the physical project operated by EXMIBAL, is an almost total anticlimax.
It's astounding when you look at the dates. How long did the mine actually operate?
The Phoenix Mine only produces nickel for about 3 years.
3 years out of a 40-year lease.
Yes, from 1977 to roughly 1980. That is the entirety of its active production window in that era. 3 years of active smelting for a contract secured with a counterinsurgency and the assassination of a congressman.
I have to ask why. That makes zero economic sense. Was there a massive miscalculation by INCO? You don't go through all that trouble to build a massive industrial facility in the jungle just to turn the lights off 36 months later? What happened?
What happened is that the immovable reality of the global commodities market crashed violently into the physical reality of the Guatemalan jungle. It comes down to geology and energy. The type of nickel ore they had at Lake Izabal is called laterite ore.
What does that mean chemically? Like, why does the type of dirt matter?
In the nickel industry, you generally have two main types of ore, sulfides and laterites. Sulfide ores are usually found deep underground, but they are relatively easy and cheap to concentrate and smelt using standard processes.
Okay.
Laterite ores, which is what they had at the Phoenix mine, are found closer to the surface. But the nickel in laterite is chemically bonded with iron and a huge amount of moisture. To separate the nickel from a laterite ore, you have to literally bake it.
Bake it.
It's like in an oven.
Essentially, yes. It requires an incredibly energy-intensive smelting process. You need massive, massive amounts of oil to power the kilns and the processing plant.
Okay, so the entire business model relies on cheap oil to bake the dirt.
Precisely. And what happens in the late 1970s?
The global oil crisis.
Yes. The OPEC embargoes hit. The cost of energy on the global market skyrockets to unprecedented levels. At the exact same time, because of broader global recessions, the market price for the nickel they are producing actually weakens. Oh man, so the cost of the fuel required to run the machines vastly exceeds what they can actually sell the finished metal for on the open market.
It was a mathematical collapse. The profit margins didn't just shrink, they inverted. By 1980, INCO's executives look at the spreadsheets and realize it is no longer economically viable to run the operation. They are burning money. Every day they keep the kilns on.
So they just cut their losses.
They make a cold business decision. They shut down production. By 1981, EXMIBAL is essentially winding down all its active operations, putting the facility on care and maintenance. The massive industrial footprint they carved out of the jungle goes dormant.
But, and this is the crucial part, the company packs up, the executives fly back to Canada, the machines go quiet, but the contract remains. The lease is still active.
Yes. The 40-year clock is still ticking.
Yeah.
They still legally control the 385 square kilometers of land. And this dormant asset kicks off a completely different kind of corporate strategy that dominates the next few decades. The ownership shuffle.
This is a really vital part of our deep dive. We need to trace this mine's ownership shift, because the flag flying over the dormant mine changes from American to Canadian to eventually Russian interests, and we need to understand how that constant corporate shuffling impacts the communities who are still living with the scars of the 1960s.
Let's map it out. So the Phoenix mine sits largely dormant, a rusting industrial complex in the jungle, through the 1980s and the 1990s. INCO holds onto the rights, basically just waiting for the market to change. And eventually, it does.
When did it turn around?
In the early 2000s, the global commodities market starts booming again. Nickel prices rise sharply, driven by new technologies and expanding global manufacturing. And suddenly, that dormant 40-year lease looks incredibly valuable again.
Enter the new players.
Right. Between 2004 and 2008, Canadian companies come back into the picture aggressively. First, a Canadian company called Sky Resources acquires the rights to the project.
Okay, Sky Resources.
Then Sky is acquired by another larger Canadian mining company called HudBay Minerals. HudBay acquires the rights and sets out to completely revive and restart the Phoenix project.
And the baton doesn't stop there.
No, it passes again. In 2011, a massive Russian-owned conglomerate called the Solway Investment Group acquires the mine from the Canadian interests. Solway operates locally in Guatemala through subsidiaries known as CGN and Pronico.
So let's look at this incredible chain of custody. The initial exploration licenses in the 1950s were American Hanna Mining. The massive 40-year lease was secured, the mine was built, and the original blood was shed under Canadian ownership INCO in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
The project was revived decades later by a second wave of Canadian owners, Sky and HudBay, in the 2000s. And finally, the massive operation lands in the hands of Russian owners, Solway, in the 2010s.
It is a perfect case study in modern globalized resource extraction. The physical asset stays in one place, but the legal ownership floats around the globe.
So what does this all mean for the people actually living there, the Kekimaya communities whose land this is?
That's the real question.
When the corporate flag on the mine gate changes from American to Canadian to Russian, who do the locals even complain to? When a family wants to seek justice for a grandfather killed in 1968 or demand the return of a farm stolen in 1975, how does this constant ownership shuffle dilute local accountability?
Well, it doesn't just dilute it, it creates a labyrinth of legal and moral evasion. When ownership patterns change like this, especially when it involves multinational parent corporations buying and selling physical assets through layers of local subsidiaries, accountability is essentially erased with every signature on a buyout agreement.
Let's explore that mechanism deeply, because this isn't just about changing the logo on the letterhead. This is a deliberate legal architecture.
Exactly. It's about the corporate veil and the concept of limited liability. Let me use an analogy.
Sure.
Think of a multinational corporation like a massive submarine. The parent company, sitting in Toronto or Switzerland, is the control room. The local subsidiary operating the mine in Guatemala is just one specific compartment in the submarine.
Okay, I'm following.
Corporate law is designed like watertight doors. If a disaster happens in the Guatemalan compartment, say a massive human rights violation or an environmental spill, the parent company can just seal the hatch. They isolate the liability to that one local entity. The local subsidiary might go bankrupt or sink, but the parent company and its shareholders stay completely dry.
So when a new parent company comes along and buys that compartment 30 years later, what happens?
The new parent company, let's say HudBay buying the asset in the 2000s or Solway in 2011, they structure the buyout very carefully. They purchase the assets, the physical mine, the lease, the equipment, but they explicitly do not acquire the liabilities of the past. Under corporate law, they do not inherit the moral or legal guilt of the 1970s counterinsurgency.
It's a legal magic trick. The land is still the exact same land. The displaced people are still living in poverty on the edge of the property. The historical trauma is still an open wound. But the legal entity responsible for inflicting that trauma simply ceases to exist, replaced by a new corporate entity that throws its hands up and says, hey, we just got here. We didn't shoot anyone in 1971. We just bought a mine.
That is the exact defense. For the Kekimaya, it means that every time they try to organize, every time they try to demand restitution for their stolen land or justice for historical violence, the target moves. They are fighting a ghost.
That's incredibly frustrating.
If they try to protest at the mine gate, the local managers say, we don't make the rules, we just report to Toronto. If human rights lawyers try to look at Toronto, the company is suddenly sold to a holding company in Switzerland with Russian owners. The corporate structure is specifically designed to be impenetrable from the ground level.
Which brings us to the next massive evolution of this story. Because despite that impenetrable corporate structure, despite the watertight doors, the communities did find a way to fight back.
They did.
The violence didn't end in 1971 with the assassination of the USAC Commission. As the mine attempted to revive and expand in the 2000s under Canadian ownership, the violence returned. But this time, the response from the Kekimaya shifted dramatically toward international courts.
This is a crucial transition in our narrative. We are moving from the Cold War era of political assassinations in the 1970s, directed by state death squads, to the modern era of corporate security violence in the 2000s. As Sky Resources and later HudBay Minerals began pushing to clear new areas to restart and expand the Phoenix mine operations, we see a renewed wave of conflict.
In 2007, the dossier notes a series of forced evictions in the Estor region.
Yes, the exact same region, the exact same underlying land disputes. The communities argued the land was theirs ancestrally. The company argued they held the legal title from the state. During these 2007 evictions, state police and private mine security forces moved in to burn down the community's homes and clear the land.
And it gets worse.
Much worse. During this specific operation, there are horrific allegations of mass rapes at a community called Lut Ocho, allegedly committed by mine security personnel, police, and military acting in concert.
And the violence escalates even further a couple of years later.
Yes.
Yes, in 2009. There are intense physical clashes involving community members protesting the mine and the mine's private security forces. During these events in 2009, a highly respected community leader and school teacher named Adolfo Mijangos is brutally targeted. He is hacked with a machete and shot dead.
Oh my God.
Furthermore, another community member, a young man named German Chubb, is shot at close range by mine security and left permanently paralyzed. I want to pause here and really contrast the evolution of the violence we are seeing. In 1971, you had the state military death squads assassinating high-profile academic intellectuals and sitting politicians in the capital city simply to protect the idea of a contract.
Right.
Now, in 2007 and 2009, you have private corporate security guards operating alongside state police, committing brutal physical acts of violence against indigenous farmers, teachers, and community leaders directly in the dirt of the contested land. The violence has evolved from political decapitation in the capital to frontline clashes over physical eviction.
It is a profound shift from ideological warfare to raw territorial warfare. The state is still involved providing the police, but the frontline enforcers of the violence are now private, uniformed security guards hired by the corporate subsidiary to protect the physical asset.
Wow.
And this specific modern violence, the brutal killing of the teacher Adolfo Mijangos, the paralyzing shooting of German Chubb, and the horrific rapes at Lode Cho becomes the catalyst for a legally unprecedented response.
The communities decide they aren't going to play the shell game anymore.
Exactly. The Quechua Maya communities, supported by dedicated international human rights lawyers, realized that trying to sue the local Guatemalan subsidiary in a local court system, a system deeply intertwined with the state that authorized the mine, is just a dead end.
So what do?
They decide to take the fight directly to the control room of the submarine. They file a series of groundbreaking lawsuits in Canadian courts against HudBay Minerals, the parent company itself.
The Chalk v. HudBay lawsuits. This is huge. Explain the specific legal argument here, because as we just discussed with the submarine analogy, corporate law is explicitly designed to prevent exactly this kind of lawsuit. How did they try to pierce the corporate veil?
They used a very specific, innovative legal theory centered around the concept of duty of care and direct negligence. They didn't just argue that the parent company is automatically responsible for everything the subsidiary does. That would be thrown out immediately.
Because of the watertight doors.
Exactly. Instead, the plaintiff's lawyers argued that HudBay executives in Canada made direct decisions about security protocols, or critically failed to implement proper oversight, despite knowing the deeply volatile and violent history of the area.
So they argued the executives in Toronto weren't just passive shareholders, they were active managers of the security situation on the ground.
Exactly. They argued that the parent company itself bears a direct, independent legal responsibility, a duty of care for the human rights abuses committed by the security personnel guarding their asset abroad. They argued that if you buy a mine in a known conflict zone and you hire armed guards, you have a legal duty in Canada to ensure those guards don't murder the local teachers.
That makes intuitive sense, but what was the response from the Canadian legal system?
In 2013, something genuinely incredible happened. The Ontario Superior Court in Canada issued a ruling allowing the Chalk v. HudBay lawsuits to proceed.
No way! They let it go forward.
They did. The court essentially said, yes, it is legally possible under Canadian law for a parent company to be held directly responsible for the actions of its subsidiaries' security forces in another country, if that direct negligence can be proven at trial.
Now, here is our crucial contested point for this section, and we have to be very precise about what that 2013 ruling actually meant legally.
Yes, we must be absolutely clear. The 2013 decision by the Ontario Superior Court only established that the claims could be heard in a Canadian court. It was a ruling on jurisdiction and whether the legal theory of duty of care was sound enough to warrant a trial.
Okay, so it wasn't a guilty verdict.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It did not, at that time, establish final liability or find HudBay Minerals guilty of the alleged crimes. It was a procedural victory. It was the judge saying, you have the right to make your case here, and the company has to face you.
But even just that procedural victory, just successfully crying open the door to a Canadian courtroom, must have sent absolute shockwaves through the global mining industry.
Massive shockwaves.
Suddenly, a mining executive sitting in a glass tower in Toronto or London has to worry that the actions of a private security guard at a remote mine in Central America or Africa could result in them facing a massive, financially ruinous lawsuit in their own home country. The submarine hatch isn't fully sealed anymore.
It fundamentally altered the risk calculus for global resource extraction overnight. It was a huge victory for human rights advocates, proving that the corporate structure wasn't entirely bulletproof. It forced parent companies to realize that ignorance of what their subsidiaries are doing is no longer a guaranteed legal defense.
So the legal battles over the 2007 and 2009 violence are raging in Canadian courts. But back on the ground in Guatemala, the reality of the mine continues. The asset changes hands again, moving to the Russian-owned Solway group in 2011. And the conflict on the ground does not stop.
No, it doesn't.
The tension over the land doesn't evaporate just because the company changed its name. This brings us to our final section, bringing the timeline all the way up to the present day.
Yes, we have to look at the modern siege, because the historical pattern of community resistance met with overwhelming state repression continued into the current decade. In 2021, under Solway's operation of the mine, massive protests erupted once again at Estor.
What were they protesting this time?
The communities were protesting the mine's ongoing environmental impact, specifically concerns over the pollution of Lake Izabal, which they rely on for fishing and survival. But fundamentally, they were protesting the ongoing structural lack of consultation.
Still.
They were arguing that the mine was operating without the legally required consent of the indigenous communities whose land it occupied. The original sin of the 1965 contract was still driving the conflict.
And how did the Guatemalan state respond to these protests in 2021?
The response was a chilling echo of the past. The Guatemalan government declared a formal state of siege in the Estor region.
The state of siege.
Yes. They suspended civil liberties. They sent in heavily armed military and national police units to violently break the community blockades. Local journalists who were trying to cover the protests were targeted, their equipment confiscated, and their homes raided. Prominent Quechua leaders were harassed, criminalized, and arrested.
It's the exact same playbook, the state once again using overwhelming military force to ensure the continuous, uninterrupted operation of the foreign-owned mine. The violence never truly stopped. It just took on modern, legally sanctioned forms like states of siege instead of hidden death squads.
But the relentless, generational push for accountability by the Quechua Maya communities finally reached the absolute highest level of international human rights law. In 2023, we get a landmark ruling that feels like the ultimate culmination of a 70-year fight that started back in 1954.
Tell us about the 2023 judgment from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. What is this court, and why does its ruling matter so much?
The Inter-American Court of Human Rights is an autonomous regional human rights tribunal based in Costa Rica. Its mandate is to interpret and apply the American Convention on Human Rights, holding sovereign states accountable for violations.
Okay, so it's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. It's not a local criminal court. It judges the actions of entire nations. And their 2023 ruling in the specific case of the indigenous Maya Quechua Agua Caliente community v. Guatemala was profoundly historic.
Break down the specific legal arguments validated by the court in this ruling. Because looking at the dossier, it seems like the court finally addressed the very questions that the USAC Commission died asking back in 1971.
They absolutely did. The court ruled definitively that the state of Guatemala fundamentally violated the rights of the Quechua communities in its handling of the mining concession. First, the court ruled on the issue of indigenous land rights.
What did they say?
The court recognized that the indigenous communities have a collective, inherent property right to their ancestral lands, completely, regardless of whether they hold a formal paper title deed issued by the modern state. The state cannot simply look at a map, declare the land empty or state-owned just because there are no Western-style deeds, and hand it to a mining company.
That ruling strikes at the very heart of the original 1965 lease. It essentially says the state leased land it didn't have the moral or legal right to lease in the first place.
Precisely. Second, the court tackled the deeply complex issue of subsoil ownership. While acknowledging that the state may claim ownership of the minerals under national law, the Inter-American Court ruled that the state cannot extract those resources if doing so destroys the environment, the social fabric, and the cultural survival of the indigenous communities living on the surface.
So they introduced a legal friction to the extraction.
Yes, and the mechanism for that friction is FPIC free, prior, and informed consent. The court validated this principle strongly.
I want to understand FPIC practically. What does that actually require a company or a state to do? Is it just sending a memo saying, hey, we're building a mine next week?
No, not at all. FPIC is a rigorous, legally binding process. Free means no coercion, intimidation, or states of siege. Prior means the consultation has to happen before the lease is signed, or the bulldozers arrive, not after.
That makes sense. What about informed?
Informed means the community must be given all the technical data, the environmental risks, the water usage, the chemical impacts in a language they actually understand. And consent implies the community actually has the power to say no. The Inter-American Court ruled that the Guatemalan state failed entirely to consult the communities before granting and renewing the concession over the decades.
And the third major pillar of the 2023 ruling.
The state's failure to protect. The court found Guatemala legally liable for failing to protect its own citizens from corporate harm. They ruled that the state systematically prioritized the economic interests of the mining project over the fundamental human rights, physical safety, and property rights of the Cachimaya.
What did they order the state to do?
The court ordered the state to grant formal land titles to the communities, to halt mining activities until proper consent is achieved, and to establish a development fund as reparations.
Okay, let's step back from the legal details and look at the massive, sweeping arc of history we have just covered. We need to bookend this story. Let's contrast the starting point in 1954 with the end point of this dossier in 2023.
The contrast is profound. It really tracks the evolution of global justice. In 1954, you have a U.S.-backed political coup that institutes a brutal might-makes-right military order. In that era, the state simply looks at a map, draws a red line around 385 square kilometers of inhabited land, and hands it to a foreign corporation.
Yeah.
When the people living there resist, the military clears them out with a counterinsurgency. When brilliant academics do the math and point out the contract is a raw deal for the country, they are shot in the back in the street. It is the absolute raw exercise of power without a shred of accountability.
And you fast forward almost 70 years to 2023. That exact same tract of land, the exact same conflict over the dirt and the nickel beneath it, is the subject of a landmark legal ruling by an international human rights court. A ruling that legally enforces indigenous rights, demands environmental protection, and holds the sovereign state liable for its historic and ongoing failures.
So what has changed? Well, the language and the architecture of international law have evolved dramatically. But more importantly, the Cachimaya communities, despite enduring decades of assassinations, massacres, evictions, and states of siege, they never gave up.
They just kept fighting.
They forced the international legal system to recognize their humanity and their rights. They built complex alliances with international lawyers across borders to sue parent companies in Canada and hold states accountable in Costa Rica. The architecture of justice has undeniably improved because the victims forced it to improve.
But what hasn't changed? Because a court ruling on paper is very different from the reality on the ground.
What hasn't changed is the land itself. The nickel is still there, buried in the laterite ore. The massive global economic pressure to extract that nickel is still immense. While the International Court issues a ruling, the reality on the ground in El Estor remains deeply fraught.
Right.
Implementing a human rights court order against a sovereign state that is still deeply intertwined with extractive industries is an incredibly slow, dangerous, and difficult process. The mine infrastructure is still a massive physical presence, the economic incentives haven't vanished, and the tension over the land remains palpable.
So looking at this entire staggering history, what is the ultimate takeaway from this dossier?
We started with a single piece of paper, a 40-year lease initiated by an American firm, built and operated by a Canadian one, and eventually bought by a Russian one. That single contract resulted in the forced displacement of entire communities, a violent military counterinsurgency, and the targeted assassinations of brilliant minds like Adolfo Mijangos López.
A man who was murdered simply for reading the contract out loud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This history shows how the initial violence required to secure a massive resource concession sets off a chain reaction of trauma and conflict that can last for generations. It survives changes in government, shifts in the global economy, and the constant evasive shuffling of corporate ownership.
And we have to connect this directly to you, the listener, because it is far too easy to hear a story about military coups in the 1950s or assassinations in Guatemala in the 1970s and think it's just a historical tragedy that happened far away, like a closed chapter in a history book, but it's not.
It is deeply physically connected to the modern world you are sitting in right now. The nickel extracted from mines, exactly like Phoenix, doesn't just disappear into the ether. It enters the global supply chain. It ends up in our daily lives.
How so?
Nickel is a critical, irreplaceable component in stainless steel. It is absolutely essential for the lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles and the transition to renewable energy. It is in the technology, the smartphones, and the laptops that we use every single day.
Right. If you are listening to this deep dive on a smartphone, Or if you drive an electric car, or even if you just use stainless steel cookware in your kitchen, you are physically touching the end product of this exact global supply chain.
This story is a blueprint for understanding the hidden human cost of that supply chain. It forces us to realize that when we talk about the green transition or the expansion of modern manufacturing, we have to look incredibly closely at where the raw materials are coming from.
We have to ask the hard questions.
What was the human cost required to extract them? Are we building the technological future on the back of historical contracts secured through violence and displacement?
Which brings us right back to where we started today, the danger of a document. We talked about how reading that 1965 contract was a lethal act for the USAC Commission. But the scariest part of the story isn't what happened in the past, it's what is happening right now, completely out of sight.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you look at the global economy today, with massive multinational corporations operating across dozens of borders, hiding liability behind ever-shifting parent companies, complex webs of subsidiaries, and watertight legal doors, you have to ask yourself a deeply unsettling question.
What's the question?
How many other dormant 40-year contracts are out there right now, sitting quietly in a filing cabinet in a corporate headquarters somewhere, written in blood, just waiting for the market price to rise so they can be unearthed?